G'day guys, have you ever wondered how they determine who plays who at competitive Warhammer 40k tournaments? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about in today's episode. We're going to talk about the current traditional model that is used around the world, and then we're also going to talk about some different examples and some alternative systems that we've tried out here in Australia with fantastic success. And then we're going to talk about some of the pros and cons of each one of these different tournament pairings methods and get your opinions in the conversation in the comments below. Let's get stuck straight into the video.
Look for the Blood God.
G'day guys, Dean here from Blog for the Blood God, and today I want to talk to you about the tournament pairings and tournament placings systems that are available out there, and talk about some of the pros and cons of each method, and get your thoughts on which method you think is superior, which method is your preferred, and which method is used in your local area when you attend tournaments. So let's get a conversation going on that. So basically what I mean by the tournament pairings and placing system is the method in which the TOs use when you arrive at a tournament to determine who plays who. Now, the vast majority of tournaments will randomize the first round. Pretty much all tournaments do that. So your first round opponent is going to be completely random. But then it breaks down into a few different methods. So there's the Swiss system, which is basically where the top placed player versus the second top placed player, and the third versus fourth, and fifth versus sixth, and so on. So basically the results from your first round are going to dictate who you play in the second, and it's generally based off battle points, with any victory points as a tiebreaker. So say you win 100 points in your first round and you get a win, that's a maximum win. Somebody else gets 98, somebody else gets 96, and somebody else gets 94. All four of you win, so you're all in the winner's bracket. And then basically you have the top versus the next. So the person who got 100 points is going to versus the person who got 98, so on and so forth. And basically this goes all the way up until the final round, and then you crown a winner. So that's one method. Then we have a what's called a bracketed system, where often what will happen is at some stage during the event, it'll pivot from Swiss into bracketed, and that's where the top player of each bracket will verse the bottom player from each bracket. And the idea here is to try to facilitate a really, really intense top table game. Because the problem with that Swiss system is the best player is always knocking down the second best player, right? And the challenge there is it actually incentivizes people to try to minimize their wins so that they don't have to verse that top player, and hope that all the top players knock each other out along the way, and then you can slide in past them. So that's the problem with having the top versus the second top, is you don't want to be the second from the top. You either want to be at the top or you don't want to be anywhere near the top, right? But you still want to keep your wins up. So the bracketed system, where what it does is it goes, okay, it might be, say it's an 8-round event. After the 5th round, for the 6th, 7th, and 8th round, they'll split into brackets, and it might be, the top 4 is one pod or one bracket, then the next 4, or it might be the top 8. This is all depending on the size of the event. And those people will play off in a bracket, and then basically the top of that bracket will verse the bottom of that bracket, and the two middle people in that bracket will verse each other. And that way, if you're in that top bracket, you're more likely to end on a game that is really intense and is a true show-off of the two best players, battling it out for the win. As opposed to the standard method, where you just you end up knocking that best player out really early in the event. Like your top table game might happen in the second round, So that's the bracketed system. Then there's also a randomized system, where what they'll do is they'll take all of the winners, all of the people in the winners pool. So if you won your first game, you'll be in the winners pool. If you lost, you'll be in the losers pool. And then they'll randomize again within that pool. And that way it completely removes any ability to sort of predict who you might verse in the next round, and sort of any ability to leverage that. Because there's a phenomenon that a lot of players have been reporting, where if say you're coming second and you're at the top of the pool and there's only 5 other undefeated players, so you know you're going to be versing one of them 5, what players have been reported to have been doing is not entering their scores, not finishing their game until the very last minute, and they'll keep refreshing BCP to find out what scores all of those other 5 players have entered. So they'll wait and they'll see, and then they'll go, okay, cool. If I get a 97, I'm going to verse person X, but if I get a 94, I'm going to verse person Y, and I would rather verse person Y, so then in the game, they'll intentionally move off of an objective, or they'll intentionally not achieve 3 points for their sub-primary, or they'll intentionally do something to reduce their score so that they can sort of manipulate who their opponent is going to be. And this is obviously a massive problem. We can't have people doing that because that's, defeats the purpose of the game. You're not supposed to be able to know who you're going to verse in the next round. So one of the ways that TOs have got around this is to randomize the pairings in those top, basically in the brackets, which are your win-loss ratio. So by round 4, you'll have 4 pods. You'll have an undefeated pod, you'll have a 3 wins and a loss pod, you'll have a 2 wins, 2 losses pod, and you'll have a win and 3 losses pod. And then within those pods, they'll randomize everything. The downside to this is that you're not guaranteed to get a top table game where you've got the best 2 players versing each other. And it's entirely possible that somebody's going to go get a 100-point win and then dodge the next best player because it's completely random. So therefore they get another relatively easy game, they get another 100-point win, and then they dodge the good players again. And it's entirely possible for somebody to fly all the way to the end, all the way to the finals, without ever having played any challenging games because it's completely random. Whereas the Swiss method, where you're playing specifically into the next best player, means that if you are at the top, in order to remain at the top, you have to verse hard players, which makes winning the event really, really challenging. Whereas adding that element of randomness means that people can there's potentially no massive challenge to getting the win. All you have to do is make sure that you keep winning games as big as you can. So there's pros and cons to both systems, right? So the randomized system has the pro that you can't game it because it's completely random and you have no idea who's going to be where. Whereas the seeded system has the advantage of ensuring that top players versus top players, and in order to win, you need to be able to beat all of the top players. The other downside to the random system, and I've heard this reported as well, is that when it's random and you have no idea of knowing who you're versing or who you should have been versing, some TOs have been known to manipulate those pairings because they know that there's no way that the players can say, hang on, I shouldn't be versing player X, I should be versing player Y. So what they'll do is they'll give their mate a leg up. If there's one of their mates at the tournament, they'll go, okay, cool, let's make it so that he doesn't have to play XYZ player, and nobody will ever know because it's all supposedly random. So I don't know how prevalent that level of corruption in TOs is, and also the cheating of the players where it's manipulating their scores to manipulate their pairings. I'm not sure how prevalent that is. It's probably very, very fringe and very rare. But the thing about tournaments is you've got to account for those fringe rare cases. When you're a TO and you're deciding what system you want to use, you need to make sure that you're building it in such a way that you have accounted for these things. So there's a few other different methods that pit players use or TOs use to pair things, but those are the sort of the main ones. And so I think that the best system is definitely the Swiss, but what I would do as a TO is hide the placings. So that way you just don't know what scores people have got, and then you don't reveal the placings until you pair the following round. So that way there's no way that your opponent can know. The only way that they can know is if they actually physically go around and ask the players what scores they got, which is unlikely to happen because in theory for this to work they need to be in the middle of their game, So if you make it so that players submit their scores, the scores are not visible until you activate the next round. And then when you activate the next round, then you load the previous round's pairings and you put them up so they're now visible. That way it eliminates players' ability to, do that. And then I think the seeding element of it, the bracketed, pod system, I think that's really useful for large events. Smaller events, not necessarily required. Now, let's talk about some other stuff when it comes to scoring and placings within a tournament, because there's another thing that I wanted to mention that's quite interesting as well, which is that the standard method, the ITC method that most people use, is basically you get 1,000 points for your win plus however many victory points you achieve during the game, so up to 1,100, and then that determines your placings. Whereas the challenge I have with that system is that incentivizes players to bring lists that are non-interactive, right? Like we all remember the old Dark Angels list that would get 100 points without firing a single bullet, right? It would just pick the secondaries where it's like, yep, cool, I'm gonna sit here on my home objective and I'm just gonna score massive victory points and that's fine. Or even the current Necron list where it's like, cool, it's got really easy to achieve secondaries where it doesn't even really need to kill you, it just needs to be there, and so that's their whole shtick, right? And the challenge I have with that is that sort of incentivizes a very non-interactive game. Whereas if you look at the WTC, the World Team Championships, or pretty much any team championships for that matter, the method that they use is a victory point differential. So you'll get victory points based on how big the score difference is between you and your opponent. And this is a much, much better system. Because what this does is this means that not only do you have to try to maximize your score, but you actually get rewarded for minimizing your opponent's score. And that way you go in there and you're like, okay, cool, I'm going to try to stop you from achieving your victory points, and I'm going to make sure that I'm achieving all of mine to try to maximize the win. And the other thing that this does, so what this does is several-fold. This is really, really good in several ways. One of them is that obviously it means that you're forced to interact with your opponent. You're not just going to be like, you know what, I'm going to let you have your secondaries because it doesn't matter, I'm going to win anyway. It's like, no, you need to keep playing. Even when you're in that winning position, you need to keep playing. And counter to that, when you're losing, it incentivizes you to keep pushing and try to keep, increase the points to minimize the win of your opponent and maximize the score that you'll get from that loss. So you still need to try to stop your opponent from scoring those victory points even when they're in a winning position. So it does that. It also completely eliminates the previous challenge, which was players, trying to manipulate their scores to try to manipulate who they're going to play into, because no player is going to sacrifice points when it's kind of come down to a differential, It also prevents players from striking deals on the tabletop, which unfortunately you do see from time to time. And that's things where it's like, like say it's a really close game and they're going to end on a 60 points to the winner and a 56 points to the loser. Well, that's all well and good, but now they're both getting relatively low scores, which means they're not likely to win the tournament. So what they'll do is they'll be like, oh, you know what, let's just say you got 3 or 4 more victory points on this, and let's say you kill this, and let's say you get primary last turn, you do really well, but let's also say that I do X, Y, Z, and blah, 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 and if I go to raise banners here, you just don't pull them down, and blah, 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 and you have all these little agreements to bump that up to an 80 points to a 76, And most of the time, both players are going to be happy with that arrangement because both of them get more victory points, right? But the problem with that is that's cheating. And that denies other players at tournaments an opportunity to score their victory points because they're playing honestly and they're entering the scores that they actually achieved. So, and we've seen games where the players will end up on 100 points to the winner and 98 points to the loser. And it's like, how the fuck does that happen? That's so rare. And yes, it does happen. I've had games where that's happened. But it's always suspicious when that does happen. You're like, especially when the two people are close mates and they walk away with that score, you're like, really? Did that really happen? Because it's very rare and you guys are friends and it's beneficial to both of you that it did happen. This is interesting, right? So that's one of the challenges with the traditional scores, whereas if you make it a victory point differential, no player is going to agree to that, because the more points that they give their opponent, the less points they get themselves. So they're going to be incentivized to make sure that, look, we're good mates, and it's unfortunate that we've been paired into each other because I don't want to have to knock you out of the event, but I'm here to win, and we're going to play a hard game, and we're going to play, honestly, and we're going to, go for the win. So the differential, I think, is a much, much stronger system for placings and for pairings. And basically what you do is you just do it exactly the same as the normal ITC, only instead of going 1,000 points for a win plus your battle points, you go 1,000 points for a win plus your differential. And the WTC use a table, which I think is perfectly fine. It's a good little table. And basically what it has is, like, if you beat your opponent by 0 to 5, you get a 11 points and they get a 9. So it's all out of 20. So 11 points and a 9. If you get an exact draw, it's 10 points per player. If you beat them by 0 to 5, you get essentially 1 extra point, they get 1 less. If you beat them by 5 to 10, you'll get 12 points, they'll get 8. If you beat them by 10 to 15, you'll get 13, they'll get 7, so on and so forth. There's a few different versions. Some of them go up by 5s in the brackets. Some of them go up by 6s. Some of them go up by whatever. So there's a few different options out there. I'm not particularly fussed on which one. I just think that using the differential is a very strong way of making this game more balanced and more interesting in tournaments, because it does all of the things previously mentioned. And there's a reason that they use it in the World Team Championships, right? It's one of the most prestigious events on the 40k calendar in the entire world, and that's the system that they use. And it's also good because it means that if you play a game, you can pick an army that's hyper aggressive, that isn't going to score its points very well, but it's really good at stopping your opponents from scoring their points. It might be a really powerful army that goes in and blows up everybody's shit early, but it has trash secondaries itself. So it doesn't score very high, but it's really good at stopping your opponent from scoring really high. That sort of army is really fun to play, and it's a shame that you don't see them at the top tables, and that's because of the scoring system. The scoring system where it's just get your victory points and try to win doesn't really incentivize that type of play style. So this is sort of my opinion piece. It's my call out to the TOs to maybe consider using a score victory point differential. You can use it in BCP. It's one of the options. So it's not like you have to do any reinventing the wheel here. Like, it's just an option that's in BCP that I wish more TOs would adopt, because I think it solves lots and lots and lots of the problems that potentially could arise at tournaments. Not common problems, these aren't common challenges, but it solves any potential challenges whilst simultaneously opening up the field for more different types of armies and more different types of play styles becoming viable. And it also just makes for a more interactive, engaging game, where instead of just sitting on your home objective scoring your victory points while they sit on theirs scoring theirs, you're actually incentivized to make sure that not only are you trying to score all your points, but you're also trying to stop all of your opponents. And ultimately, the thing about that is it really does reward player skill, because being able to score your own victory points whilst being conscious of your opponent's victory points and trying as hard as you can to deny them points whilst generating them yourself is a challenging thing, and it requires a lot of skill to pull that off. So seeing that rewarded on the table in tournaments is something that I would really like to promote, and something that I'd really like to see more of. So yeah, that rounds out this video. Thanks for tuning in, guys. Let me know what you think. Let me know what sort of tournament system you guys use in your local area. Let me know what your preferred method is, and let me know if you have any challenges with the existing method and whether or not you think that a differential would solve them, and whether or not you think that just hiding the pairings hiding the placings is a really good solution, or whether you think that we need to go further with this and do some other stuff. I know there's the Risky Rollers lads here in Melbourne are working on a really, really in-depth system that's going to do pairings based off a really complex algorithm where it's going to take your faction's win-loss ratio, your opponent's faction's win-loss ratio, your personal win-loss ratio, your opponent's win-loss ratio, all of these things into account. You know, your opponent's current ITC ranking, your ITC ranking. It's going to take a whole bunch of different things into account when determining how many victory points you'll get or battle round points you'll get for winning and or losing. And their goal there is to incentivize those who go in and beat the stronger players. That's got to be worth more than beating a weak player. So that's sort of the idea that they're working on, is a really in-depth, interesting and complex kind of system, which is going to hopefully make tournaments a little bit more interesting, a little bit more exciting. I'm not going to lie, I'm a little skeptical that they'll pull it off, but we'll see. But yeah, I'm going to leave the video there. I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers. Alrighty guys, thanks for tuning in. I really hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, like, subscribe, comment, all that good shit. And you can also pick up merchandise like this t-shirt, like the dice that we've got coming out, like the objective markers that we have. All really great ways to show your support for the channel. Or if you would like more one-on-one coaching and list advice with myself, you can join our Patreon. You get exclusive access to a Discord server where we work together as a community to make sure that we're all achieving our personal best results at every event. So with that being said, I'll leave it there. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.
Look for the Blood God.